Let's talk about the Chinese Zweihander. So most of you watching this channel will be very familiar with the large two-handed swords found in late medieval and Renaissance Europe, a bit like the so-called Zweihander or Montante Spadone behind me. But what most people don't know, certainly most people in the West don't know, is that large two-handed swords like this beast, the striking eagle from LK Chen that I'm holding in front of me, which as you can see comes up almost to my chin in its scabbard, these types of large two-handed swords existed in China over 2,000 years ago. Now, I have previously reviewed the Roaring Dragon, which is another one of LK Chen's large two-handed swords. As you can see, put with the scabbard ends or shapes on the ground, the Roaring Dragon is very slightly shorter than this striking eagle. That's a little bit of hilt length difference and quite a lot of, of blade length difference and quite a bit of hilt length difference. So the striking eagle has a slightly longer blade and a slightly longer hilt. And this is modelled on or inspired by the size of an original example found in a tomb dating to the 1st century BC. Okay, so 100 years before Christ. And this type of sword, these types of very large two-handed swords, were used in the Chu kingdom between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century BC. And you've got to bear in mind that that is an extraordinary achievement to make a steel-bladed two-handed sword at this period. There are basically with a few possible exceptions, there are basically no one else in the world at this time in the 2nd and 1st century BC making swords like this of these proportions. Just simply making steel at this time was an accomplishment enough, but to make a steel-bladed sword with a blade this long and a tang this long, really quite amazing engineering achievement. And also, of course, it raises a lot of questions about how these were actually deployed. Were these just the weapons of bodyguards and courtiers? Were these weapons carried on the battlefield? Well, the evidence suggests that both of those. These have been found in very high status tombs, so clearly they were the sidearms of very high status people and show-off items to a certain point, probably also used by specific types of elite soldier as well. And there is some suggestion that a certain type of armour, which was very, very protective, sometimes made of rhino hide, in this period enabled the use of these two-handed swords, because of course usually in this period we're looking at the use of one-handed swords, and I've looked at the magnificent Chu jian here, one-handed sword used with a shield. So the normal armament of an infantryman, an army infantryman at this time, is a one-handed sword like this magnificent Chu, which is a lovely gorgeous sword from LK Chen, used in conjunction with a shield. Now, therefore, the use of these two-handed swords is really, really quite unusual and specialised, and as far as I'm aware, pretty much unique in the world at this point. So a lot of the things I've said in my Roaring Dragon review would stand for this striking eagle. There are some differences between the two, and given that I've done the Roaring Dragon review previously, if you haven't seen that and you're interested in these swords, go and watch that first, and I do cut with it as well. I thought I should kind of compare the two. So if I would just dispense with the scabbards for a minute, obviously there are some aesthetic differences and stylistic choices between the two, but there are some differences in the basic weapons themselves. So I talked about the length. Okay, so the length of the blade is not very different. The striking eagle at the bottom here is slightly longer, but you'll also notice it is slightly narrower, slightly more tapered and slightly narrower. They're about similar breadth at the base of the blade, but the striking eagle tapers down more, so that the total kind of mass and what you feel in front of your hand is very, very similar between the two. What you really get with the Roaring Dragon is a slightly broader centre of percussion, but a slightly shorter blade, as opposed to the striking eagle, which has a slightly longer blade and is slightly narrower. In terms of the guards, let's just bring those closer to the camera for you. You'll see that the Roaring Dragon has a slightly longer guard and the striking eagle has a slightly shorter guard. Now remember that in this period those guards are not really hand guards from other people's weapons principally, although the slightly longer one on the Roaring Dragon will have that effect to some degree. The very short guard on the Striking Eagle is unlikely to protect your hands from very much. It's more really to stop the hand going anywhere near the blade. Now, between these two, they do have quite different grips on them. The sort of almost oval, I suppose it is, isn't it? It's cylindrical at the top and it's oval at the guard end. Okay, so oval cross section here, which gives quite good edge alignment on the Roaring Dragon, but it is fairly rounded grip. Conversely, on the Striking Eagle, it's quite a flat grip, and I actually prefer that because the flat grip gives really good sense of edge alignment. So I find comparing the two, whilst the Roaring Dragon grip is very comfortable and I think looks nicer to my eyes actually, the Striking Eagle grip is actually better ergonomically in terms of edge alignment, but also in terms of this detailing of these bands of cord up here, which mean that they're quite good stop ribs and keep your hand where they're supposed to be. This is a sort of feature that we find on some European swords where we have ribs on the grip, or sometimes a flared section in the middle to separate the upper and lower halves. And this does give a good grip on the sword and keeps the hands where they're supposed to be, as I say. There is a detail that comes between these bands, which is this cord, which is how you get from this section up to this section, up to this section, and so on. And I do find it a bit disconcerting how those move, because obviously they're stretched over a long distance, so they can't be completely taut. But when you're handling the sword, I do find that movement a little bit strange in my hand, and I can't say I'm a big fan of it. The hilt fittings are not as detailed on the Striking Eagle as on the Roaring Dragon. They're quite plain, but they are exactly like the originals that have been found from this period. They're cast in bronze, precision cast in bronze, and they're very, very nice. The blade is absolutely gorgeous pattern. So just bring it up here. I'll show you there you go. You can see the pattern in the steel. It is pattern welded. As I've pointed out in previous videos, this is not 100% authentic to the type of steel that they were using at the time. They used laminated folded steel, so you would have seen the structure in the steel, especially if you etched it. So it wouldn't have looked exactly like this pattern welded finish, but you would have seen a structure. So in that sense, it's sort of simulating the structure that you might see in the complex steel, and highlighting the fact that it's not mono steel because they didn't have crucible mono steel at that date. No one did. The blade is quite flexible. So one of the things you first notice when handling this sword is that it has quite a lot of lateral wiggle, and it is really quite easy to flex the blade quite a lot. Okay, it's got great heat treatment temper. It seems to be really well spring tempered, no issues with, I can actually poke this on my ceiling, with flexing it really quite a long way and it returns to true, no problem at all. I can do it on the beam behind me here. You can bend it a lot and it comes back perfectly straight. The edge sharpness is, like all LK Chen swords, okay. So two factors you've got here. You've got edge fineness and then you've got edge geometry. The edge geometry is fantastic, single bevel, maybe a slight micro bevel for the final sharpen, but they're not quite polished to razor, kind of hair cutting sharpness. Couple of hairs came off then actually. They're not quite, they're not so sharp that I'm not afraid, or rather I'm afraid to run my hands up and down the blade. You can see I can do that fairly gingerly and it's not going to cut my hand. But as I say, the blade is quite flexible, and with any long blade, this is always an issue. When you make a blade over a certain length, you either are going to end up with a more flexible blade, or you have to build it up and make it heavier so that you give it rigidity, but then you make it a heavier, clunkier blade. With the Striking Eagle design, what they've elected to do is kept quite a narrow blade that further gets even more narrow because it tapers, and it does have distal taper. It's about 6 millimeters thick here, and it tapers down to what I would presume is about 3mm. So it has quite a bit of taper, and you'll notice it does flex more towards the tip than towards the base, but it does flex somewhat throughout the blade, but more in the second half, which is as you'd want. But it is a very flexible blade, and that does mean that it's less forgiving in certain types of cuts and certain types of movements. For example, if you were to cut from the right and then switch round from the left, you do feel the blade flexing. And that brings in another issue with this particular model of sword. When a blade flexes, not only what's in front of your hand flexes. If I hit the pommel, you'll notice that the blade wobbles, as most flexible blades will, okay? But you'll also notice that the pommel wobbles, and that just demonstrates the fact that the tang bends as well as the blade. Now that introduces, with any long hilted sword that has a flexible tang, and all tangs flex to some degree, but obviously it relates to how thick the tang is as to how much it will flex. When you have a long tang and you have flex in the tang, that introduces issues to do with the construction of the hilt, because of course the hilt has to accommodate that flexing, and if there's anything glued or riveted in that hilt, it can be disrupted by the fact that the tang is flexing, and that is an issue with this model of sword that you should be aware of. When I first got this sword, I was first of all noticed how flexible it was, and I have to say, for that reason I did prefer the Roaring Dragon, because the Roaring Dragon is also flexible, but its oscillations reduce to zero much more quickly. So when you do that, it stops oscillating more quickly than the narrower and longer blade and longer tang of the Striking Eagle. So in that sense, the Roaring Dragon is a stiffer and more stable sword, and turning from left to right is really quite comfortable and not problematic with the Roaring Dragon. But I do find it a bit of an issue with the Striking Eagle, and as hinted at a second ago, this does give some structural problems with the hilt of the Striking Eagle. One of those will be, if I move this close to my speaker, so I have not cut with this sword yet. Just in dry air practicing, it has already got a bit of movement in the guard, which is not really what you want. And one of the reasons is that LK Chen put glue into the construction of their hilts, which is traditional. Don't think that glue is only a modern thing or is a bad thing. Many traditional swords had their hilts, and true of knives and daggers as well, including things like kukris, tulwars, peshkabs, chara, this kind of Middle Eastern swords. A lot of them have glue in the construction of their hilts. So it is traditional. It was done, and it almost certainly was done in Chinese swords as well. But it does mean that sometimes the glue fails, and the problem is when you've got a very flexible tang in a long hilt, that can happen. So the first thing to highlight is that this guard is unfortunately not tight on the tang anymore. It doesn't wobble so much as it clicks between one position and another position. Okay, so you won't be able to see any movement in the guard, but it's obviously there because you can hear it. Secondly, the issue is when you do this to the blade, the hilt all feels totally secure. The pommel is, I believe, riveted internally onto the tang, and then you have wooden slats either side which are wrapped in silk cord. Very nicely done. But because when I deliberately wobble this sword, there is flex not just in the blade but also in the hilt, we also get a strange and slightly ominous sounding creak inside the hilt when we do it. I will try to do it in such a way that you can hear it now. Hopefully you can hear that. Now, that is the sound of the wooden slats either side of the steel tang flexing, and the glue that was presumably between them and the tang kind of having a friction to them. So the glue has broken. This hilt is totally secure on the tang, but there is movement between the grip and the tang. And I have to be completely honest here. I don't necessarily at all see this as a failure in this sword or see it as a problem in the design or anything else. It is more just a feature that you have to be aware of. When you have a blade that is this long and this flexible, and a tang that also flexes and is also long, you are going to get lateral movement between the tang and the actual hilt itself. Right, just to finish off, I'm going to go and do my first bit of cutting with this sword and see how it does. But overall, I would say that these swords are amazing replicas of a type of sword which have an amazing place in history and are fascinating things. But I have to make you aware of some of the features of this kind of design, some of the potential drawbacks or things to be made aware of. And I think, you know, LK Chen is only too aware of the characteristics of this type of sword. And when, as I always say in my videos, when you gain something, you give something away. And in this case, we've got an incredibly long and light and narrow blade, which means I can reach and strike from so far away so quickly. But that does mean that the blade is flexible, the tang is flexible, and that has other ramifications that you must be aware of. Right, let's go and have a little bit of a cut with this thing. So that's interesting. It's with this type of flexible blade, you're very reliant on getting the edge alignment perfect. But when you do, because of the tip speed, because of the length, you can leave the bottle standing. And this isn't particularly sharp. That's purely to do with the extra length and the velocity you've got at the tip speed. So it's really quite impressive actually what you can get with that extra length on the blade and that tip velocity. It's impressive and it's not particularly sharp. So I didn't leave it standing that time, but very, very clean cut. Couldn't quite get close enough to that last one. So 6 cuts, almost 7. It cuts better than I thought it would, I've got to say, and I think a lot of it is to do with the leverage. You've got a very long grip to apply energy to, very long blade, high tip speed. quite impressed, to be honest. So I guess in many ways this is exactly the sort of blade that I always say does well on water bottles. It's long, light, quick and relatively thin blade. So little amount of resistance, high velocity, that kind of thing. But we know that different kind of blades do better on different kind of targets. I'm going to be brutal to this now, and I'm going to try it on a piece of dried wood and see what happens. I suspect that we'll have more issue being a narrower, flexible blade that I think is not as stiff and stable as the kind of blades that tend to do well on wood. But let's see. This is a dry but solid piece of fairly thick, I think it's silver birch, but we'll see what happens. Well, that is, I don't know how well you'll be able to see on camera, that's 50% of the way through this really quite substantial piece of wood, from there to there. I'm really surprised actually by how solid this was when it impacted. There's no bends, no visible edge damage. I'm actually going to have another go because that was surprising to me and I wasn't using full power. Okay, so two interesting things have happened here. First of all, a very, very substantial cut. Smooth, but it's scooped. The second interesting thing is I have a bend. I don't know if you'll be able to see on camera. Try and get it there. I don't know how well you guys are seeing that, but it's slightly bent up. Now, here's the interesting thing. So it's a very slight bend at one specific place. I'm going to have a go at straightening this under my foot here on the grass and see what happens. And it's perfectly straight again now. So, if anything, that is a testament to the heat treatment on LK Chen's blades. It was only a slight set that it took, and for all of you who are those out there who are about to say that this is abusive testing, yes it is. It's not destructive testing. It's hitting the sort of thing that a sort of blade like this might hit. It might hit a horse's head, it might hit a helmet, a shield, the shaft of a polearm like a halberd. So absolutely, a piece of wood like this is not outside of the realms of things that a sword like this might hit. And it's done a fearsome cut. That would easily go halfway through a spear shaft. It might render the spear, it might break the spear, it might render the spear unusable. This is thicker than a spear shaft, quite, I would say, considerably thicker than most spear shafts. And that is more than half of the way through, and it's cut all the way down to there. Okay, so that is a long amount of dried wood to get through. Very impressive and better than I expected. And you know, it is perfectly straight again now. Now, as for it being a testament to LK Chen's heat treatment, that's exactly what you want a blade to do. You don't want a blade to bend easily, and you definitely don't want it to break. You want it, in a worst case scenario, to bend a bit so that you can straighten it back again. And that's exactly what's happened here. The edges are still sharp, there's no edge deformation or damage. I'm really super impressed. There is one thing which has come back to haunt the testing, which I suspected would be an issue. Remember I mentioned these being a bit loose and annoying? There we go. That's why it's actually come out, and that's annoying that comes out that easily. I can push it back in or cut it off or whatever, but I don't like these vertical bits. They look super cool, but they feel weird in the hand because they move around when you're holding the sword. And look, oh, that one's come out as well. They move around under the hand and they don't feel nice. With those gone, I actually much prefer the grip now. So I think those were a mistake, or they're not executed in the right way. I hope this has been an interesting and useful review. I have been surprised by this sword. It's got that creaking issue, but funnily enough, there you go, it's got that creaking issue, which is not really a structural problem, it seems. I struck hard target here, and it survived to tell the tale. So the main thing, I guess, with these swords is the blade good, and I would say the blade is damn good. The hilt construction maybe needs to be looked at a little bit in the future, but it's strong, nothing's broken, nothing's come apart. And how it cut through the bottles more easily and more perfectly than I anticipated, given the flexibility of the blade and how flexible blades are often not very forgiving, and it cut through the wood far better than I expected. One of those things is edge alignment, and a flexible blade needs to be well aligned to perform well. If it's a flexible fine blade, it will cut well if the edge alignment's good. If you get the edge alignment bad, you might bend, destroy the blade, or you might just not cut at all. But one of the things that helps with edge alignment with this is how flat that grip is, which is really great. It's broad this way, thin this way, and that really helps with the edge alignment. And coupled with this blade, that's the perfect combination. This blade needed that hilt, and that's what it got. Needed that edge alignment assistance. So I would say overall some constructive feedback for LK Chen, but the Striking Eagle is a formidable sword that can hit through light targets beautifully and through solid targets surprisingly well also. Hope this has been useful. Take care folks, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.